Great. So Peter, if you want to advance to the next slide. So many of you may know this already, but a CISMA is a Cooperative Invasive Species Management Association. And it's just a relatively informal collection of folks who either work for various agencies, nonprofits, or just concerned citizens who are have some knowledge about invasive species and plants and are motivated to try to do something about invasive species. And we work together to try to educate the public, raise awareness, and identify projects where we can seek to address invasive species concerns. The Southeastern Vermont CISMA was formed in 2020, so we're still a fairly new group. Today's program is going to actually have quite a few presenters for you. Myself, Sam Schnesky, who's the Windham County Forester, Isabel Bowman, who's Conservation Specialist with the Windham County NRCD, Peter Van Loan, who's the Lead Forester with the Vermont Land Trust, Helen Ramspot, who is Land Management Coordinator and Vermont Land Trust VHCB AmeriCorps member, Sam Farwell, who is a private landowner, and he's going to talk about his property that is our case study that you'll have a chance to go visit in June. Emma Keister, who's soil conservationist with the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service, and Andrew Morrison, owner and consulting forester of Forest Care.
Thanks, Corey. So I'm going to start us out with a little bit of definition. We're going to talk about a couple of pieces of terminology that you'll hear during this webinar. And one, for the purposes of this webinar, we're going to define an invasive species as a plant that was brought from somewhere else, is outside its natural habitat, either by accident or intentionally. And as a result of its being here, it is causing some harm. It is doing some damage. The other thing we're going to talk about a little bit, you may hear folks mention, is so-called early detection and rapid response. And that's really just what it sounds like. If you are able to detect an invasive plant early when it's getting established and you respond to it quickly, you have a really good chance of controlling it. So the phrase can be used sort of in that way, but it also is sometimes used as a reference to a species that is new to an area. So for example, in Brattleboro, unfortunately, we're dealing with Japanese stiltgrass right now, which is entirely new to our region. So it's an early detection, rapid response species for Brattleboro and for around here. And hopefully you'll be hearing, if you are from Brattleboro, you'll be hearing more about that from us later in the summer. So let's talk a little bit about what the impacts of invasive plants are and why we should care. I mean, we hear a lot about how invasive plants take over and create monocultures and change habitat, but I'd like to get a little bit more specific. I'm going to talk a little bit about the species that I'm going to cover later in the presentation, which is barberry. So if we consider an area, or think about an area that gets invaded by barberry and it takes over, let's say a mixed hardwood stand in the woods around here, it's going to preclude all those native shrubs from growing. And we have the Land Trust owns a property in West Brattleboro where we'll be showing some of this. So for instance, hobblebush will be excluded from the understory, and hobblebush is a wonderful habitat, and it is the preferred nesting habitat for black-throated blue warblers. So if you have so many invasives that your hobblebush is gone, you're also losing the warblers from that area. And then if you have a really thick barberry infestation, what that's going to do is force deer to browse on all the native trees, seedlings and saplings that are coming up, and it will take away that sort of natural species and biodiversity that we find in the understory, and you'll have the the chance, a much greater chance of that entire ecosystem sort of collapsing, because you've got native mature trees, but you've got nothing to replace them other than invasives underneath. Another way that invasives have a chance, have really do damage to our, is through economic harm. And I think about that in a couple of ways. Again, thinking about that barberry stand, if the sugar maple seedlings and saplings can't grow up through there, they're getting overbrowsed by deer, then your ability to in the future manage for timber, get some income from timber, or get income or maple syrup from sap, that all goes away. So there's economic damage there, but there's also, if you think about it, quite a bit of economic damage that can be done by just changing the nature of our Green Mountains, right? We have this huge tourism industry. People come to Vermont because of our wonderful forests, and they love to recreate out there. And if we lose that, then we stand to lose quite a bit economically. And the last thing I guess we'll talk about is and look at is the impact on our health. And specifically in regards to barberry, there's a real connection between dense barberry and a higher population of black-legged ticks and a higher incidence of Lyme disease. So there's a physical health threat, but there's also, I found around the time of the pandemic, there's a real mental health threat as well. I was out in the summer of 2020, meeting outside with folks, talking to them about their land. And a number of them said to me, they no longer go to some of their favorite places on their properties because there's so many invasive plants there. They just can't stand to go there anymore. It's just not fun. And you think about, trying to walk through an area that's really dense with barberry or multiflora rose and all that, those thorns, it's really not a very pleasant experience. So it can also have an effect on people's mental health. So there are a number of reasons why we care about invasive species and the impacts that they're having. And I suppose I'm probably preaching to the choir because all of you are here to try to learn how to control them. But I thought I'd just try to get a little bit more specific rather than talking about sort of the broader impacts of habitat loss and that sort of thing. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to Sam to tell us a little bit about his experience trying to control invasives on his property.
It's invasive plant workshop that
Sam, are you out there?
I was just going to say,
He's
Corey, do you see
muted.
Sam
He's
out there
muted.
still?
Yeah,
Just has his mute
Sorry,
button on.
I'm here now.
Perfect.
I forgot that I was muted.
Great, thanks,
Oh.
Sam.
And thank you. Okay, so this slide is a picture of part of my land. And you can see, well, if you recognize knotweed, it's very happy there, growing very densely along the West River. The area that I am currently getting help managing is a floodplain along the West River. And initially, this was all started between me and Corey, actually, because he put out a little teaser for that there might be financial assistance to landowners who wanted to plant trees along riparian areas. I think it was called Trees for Streams. And I said, yes, I would. And so he came out and took a look and said, well, before we do that, we'll want to get rid of the invasives. And did you know you can apply for this and that program? And that began a whole process that has been a couple of years so far. And so I'm here to talk about it and more about it when you come in June to see the actual site. I did end up applying to NRCS for what's called, what the program is called EQIP or EQIP funding. And I think Emma Keister later will be talking about that program. I was working with her predecessor And we've briefly connected this spring. And so I look forward to working with Emma this summer as my work progresses. The other funding mechanism that was available that Corey also assisted in getting me connected to was through U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I think it's called U.S. Fish and Wildlife Partners. And it was just additional funding, particularly for high value areas near, I believe, near rivers and streams. And we were very fortunate when someone came out to look at our site that we spotted a wood turtle, and that just kind of clinched the deal. But I think there are many ways in which an area can be deemed high value for wildlife. So initially, I had a situation with invasives, kind of the way Peter described it. It was so bad and so overwhelming, and in some places, literally, you could not walk through it, that I couldn't fathom tackling all of it in one project. And I suggested with Corey that, well, let's just deal with the knotweed part. And we proceeded down that with that strategy in mind. But the EKIP program, the NRCS program, and Emma will probably clarify this, but at the way my application turned out, the NRCS wanted to deal with all the invasives on the property. Well, that was kind of their MO. So that meant more than just the knotweed, which was growing along the river shore, but a whole area that was glossy buckthorn, multiflora rose, honeysuckle, bittersweet, all in this sort of amazing, grown together, impassable jungle. And we will see how our contractor, who will be on the site visit as well, has done an amazing job of managing that. We're in year 2 of a 3-year process, so we're going to see kind of what it looks like in the middle. But that was particularly with the multiflora rose and bittersweet growing around the others, literally something you could not walk through. And when I took Jess Applin, the project lead for the contractor land stewardship, to see it, we literally got down on our hands and knees to crawl through areas. So that is I guess my description of what we started with. And last year they sort of did the initial phase of cutting back the large growth and treating what grew back that summer. And I guess at the site visit, we'll talk more about sort of the boots on the ground strategies, and land stewardship will be on site to really get into the weeds about that. Corey, is there other stuff that I should touch on before?
No, I think you've given a nice overview.
Yeah.
If folks come to the event on June 7th, you'll get to see this property up close and personal and have a chance to ask questions of Sam and of Jess and the rest of us.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Sam.
Oh, right. This is another slide of that floodplain. There's wetlands. You're not really seeing the invasives jump out in this spot, but to the right, it gets very bad. We'll see that in June.
Great, thank you, Sam. I think we'll turn it over now to Helen, who's going to talk about bittersweet. It looks like maybe there was some bittersweet behind that hardwood in the foreground there.
Yeah, possible.
Hi, everyone. Peter and I are sharing a computer because I'm having some technology issues with mine. So Asiatic bittersweet originates in East Asia. It became established here because it was planted as an ornamental. Its woody stem and the berries, which you can see on the bottom left there, are used as fall decoration because they're very attractive. So it's a deciduous woody vine, and it climbs by twining around structures for support, and those structures are often trees. It can grow up to 60 feet and has a diameter of up to 10 feet. So as it's using these trees for support, it's often girdling them, which is shown in the top left photo. And that girdling makes the trees vulnerable to uprooting or falling over in weather events like heavy snow or wind. It also can overshadow vegetation when it becomes well established. So it's very fast growing, and it can get established really quickly. And it's also really difficult to remove because it has something called root suckers, which are buds that appear on the root of the vine. So they're dormant when the plant is healthy, but when it gets pulled out of the ground, they can sprout and start new plants. As far as identification, the leaves are light green in color, and they're alternate, which means that they don't appear directly opposite each other across the stem. They're slightly spaced as you're looking up the vine. And they have a slightly toothed edge, which you can see maybe in the bottom left photo there. The flowers are small and greenish yellow in color, which you can see in the rightmost photo there. They appear in May to early June. The fruit starts out as a greenish color and then eventually becomes more yellow as time goes on. And eventually that yellow cover splits open and reveals kind of a bright red berry. And that happens in July to October. The stem is gray, brown, and woody when it's mature, and then bright green when it's young. And then on the slide before, I can just go back and show that. You can see that the root is a really bright orange color, and that's another way you can identify it. It looks very similar to American bittersweet, and I included on this slide just a comparison of the two. American bittersweet is on the left of the photo, or it's on the right of the photo. And the berries are at the end of the stem. And then Asiatic bittersweet has them at the leaf axils, so they're more spread out throughout the stem. It also looks similar to grapevines, but you can tell the difference from the grapevine because grapevines are a darker brown in color and much more flaky. You can almost like peel the bark off of them. So moving on to control. For larger plants, larger bittersweet vines, it's recommended, if you don't want to use chemicals, to cut it close to the root collar, which is where it emerges from the ground, and repeat that process every 2 weeks until it's not growing anymore. Generally avoid hand pulling unless you're positive that you can get the entire plant out, because if you leave any of the root behind, like I talked about earlier, it can resprout really easily. If you are going to hand pull smaller plants, doing it when the ground is damp is helpful, because you're more likely to get the entire plant out. If you are doing chemical treatment, it generally should be performed by a licensed applicator. And what they would do is a foliar spray on the leaves of the bittersweet, or a cut stump process, which is similar to the mechanical process that I just talked about, where you're cutting the stump close to where it comes from the ground and applying herbicide to it. And I included here a picture of a forest that has been really overtaken by bittersweet. You can see it all over the plants there. And that's all I have on bittersweet. Pass it on to Sam, who's going to talk about glossy buckthorn.
Thank you, Helen. So the glossy and common buckthorn were planted as hedges and for wildlife value. This was prior to us realizing that actually it's kind of like the Doritos compared to the native broccoli, but this is, science evolving here and us figuring out stuff uh, as as we learn more about it as time goes on. So next slide. Oop, back one. So glossy buckthorn, it has what they call kind of a false thorn at the end. It's not really as thorny as common buckthorn. You'll see, but Peter, yeah, with their little cursors hitting the false thorn, it's actually the end of a bud. Typically, the berries are bluish to black, and it's a single stemmed tree that only gets to 20 or 25 feet tall at its max and 10 inches in diameter. The leaves are glossy, as the name would indicate, and smooth edged. And on the bark, kind of looks like a pretzel rod. You can see on the right side of the screen, the lenticels are sort of randomly dispersed over the twig. The roots are reddish and yellow, just kind of actually like bittersweet. And then they spread by seed moved, mainly by wildlife and water. These berries actually float. So if they hit the water, a moving water source, they can get dispersed fairly easily. But normally they're dispersed through birds perching. Another bad thing about glossy buckthorn for wildlife is that the berries act as a laxative. So really, there's little to no nutrients that birds get from eating berries off of these invasive plants. Next slide, please, Peter. So here we have common buckthorn. You can see the thorn is much more pronounced, and those actually hurt when they poke you. The common buckthorn also has a different looking leaf. The leaves are toothed, and the veins from the mid vein, they head out from the mid vein and head right towards the end of the leaf, right towards the tip. Whereas glossy buckthorn, they head out from the mid vein and go right towards the edge of the leaf. And again, you can see this weak thorn. I don't really like to call it a weak thorn because, as I said, I've been jabbed by a lot of those and none of them feel weak. But the bark on glossy or common buckthorn, when the plates get bigger, can actually get flaky, which is not the case on glossy buckthorn. So the top right picture is a picture of a larger common buckthorn. Next slide is next slide, please. Oh, actually, yeah, if you go back again, sorry, Peter, just quickly. The reddish yellow color underneath the bark is a giveaway too. That where your that's not where your cursor is. That's where mine is. But the scraped piece of bark there that shows the reddish yellow color underneath. A little echo there. Somebody unmuted there. Oh, that's better. Okay, next, please, Peter. So a little bit of comparison. The common buckthorn tends to have multiple stems at the base, where glossy buckthorn's a single stem. As I noted, they both have yellow sapwood. You can scrape the bark and see the sapwood that's yellowish, orangish. The fruits are similar. On glossy buckthorn, they can be a little bit bluer or reddish than really dark black as they are on common buckthorn. The leaves, as I pointed out, the glossy buckthorn, they're smoothed edge. There's no teeth. It's not toothed on the edge of the leaves, whereas with the common buckthorn, they do have small teeth. And then the vein radiating outward from a central mid vein to the leaf margins on glossy versus common, shooting right towards heading towards the tip of the leaf is another good giveaway. And they're spread, moved by wildlife, and again, occasionally by water. Berries dropped in water, they'll move. Another slide, Peter. So there are some lookalikes and some nice native alternatives that Corey sells at the plant sale. I think you said to do speckled alder and silky dogwood, right, Corey? maybe there's others, the alternate leaves with choke cherry. I don't know if those are options.
No speckled alder this year, but yes, silky dogwood, yes, chokecherry.
Okay, great. So lookalikes, I mean, you can see the leaves on dogwoods in particular look really almost exactly like glossy buckthorn leaves to me. One of our previous webinars and field visits, we have a demonstration where you can break a dogwood leaf kind of in half and pull it, so you're breaking the veins on the leaf, and when you pull that slowly, you see there's actually like a little hair that's connected, where that's not the case on glossy buckthorn. So I remember it by like hair of the dog. When you break the leaf, you see the hair, it's dogwood, not a buckthorn and not a chokecherry. Next slide, please. And then some control methods. Besides, obviously, there's chemical control methods, which would involve foliar spray or basal bark or stump treatments that should be done by a licensed professional. Some of the manual approaches would be pulling, or these things called buckthorn baggies. Pulling is pretty effective on plants up to 2 inches. Bigger than that, it's you need a tractor or a bunch of kids or grandkids to muckle onto one big thing and tell them you'll give them a prize at the end if they get the thing pulled out of the ground. I have a weed wrench that's available for loan from my office, so happy to lend that out and just kind of keep track of who's got it for a couple weeks. We ask that you don't hold on to the thing for months and years, but it's there for folks to try out. And the weed wrench is what you're seeing in that picture, that orange thing and the yellow and the white thing, just give you a great mechanical advantage for pulling out larger plants. It's easiest to pull in wet soil, but when you do any of this pulling, it creates ground disturbance, which is a great seed bed for any berries that may be lingering around or other invasive plants nearby. So it's important to kind of look at your situation and assess if it's feasible or not. And usually small areas are pretty feasible. Large areas, you pull buckthorn for a few months or a summer, and there's really a high rate of folks deciding that they don't want to pull buckthorn the next year after they put in that kind of time. And luckily, if you do put in that kind of time, your buckthorn population has hopefully been pretty substantially reduced as well. These buckthorn baggies are something that we've talked about with other regional CISMAs. So we're not the only one in the state, the only Cooperative Invasive Species Management Association. We haven't decided yet, I don't think, if we're going to do this, but with some of the others, we thought maybe we'd pool our resources and buy a bunch of buckthorn baggies to have for sale for folks through the CISMA. So it's a great idea. I don't know if it's actually going to happen, but the point is buckthorn baggies exist, and they're basically heavy-duty black plastic that you smother the buckthorn plant with. Next slide, please. On to multiflora rose. Again, this one was introduced with good intentions. Wildlife habitat, natural hedgerow, a growing fence that would ideally keep animals in place. And it's a bush. We should put nasty in front of that for the description, nasty bush. But anyway, it's pretty horrible to try to get through. It's pretty, smells good, but that's where all its positive attributes end. Next slide, please. So identification for this, the one takeaway, I mean, there's wild rose, there's ornamental rose that you wouldn't see taking over a pasture or a field or sprouting up in openings in the woods, but you may see some other species that kind of have you thinking, wondering about it. The take home is the fringed petiole, the right side of the picture here. That's a real, I don't know if there's any other rose that has that. So the petiole's the connection between the leaf and the stem, and that thing is, you see it and you're like, oh yeah, that's a great word for it. It's fringed. So that's the one best kind of identification point. And then the fruit, they have small rose hips. The other, I would say best, but worst identification are the huge thorns that are like cat's claws that can grab onto you and hold you, and they can be really horrible. It can get pretty big. It says height 15 feet tall. I've actually seen it higher than that, and kind of supported by a pine tree that it was growing into, and just looked up and thought, holy heck, what is that way up there? And it was multiflora rose had gotten 20 or 30 feet up, and it's not a vine. So the flowers are small, white, pinkish, 5-petaled, and they occur in clusters on the plant in the spring. So yeah, I think, is that, no, we'll go on another one. Do I have another or no? No, I will pass it on to Peter.
All right, thanks, Sam. I'm going to talk about Japanese and common barberry. So the Japanese obviously is from Japan, common is from Europe. They were both brought over as ornamentals. The common was brought over a little bit earlier, and was brought because folks like to make jams and jellies out of the berries, which is kind of hard to imagine, but I guess they made do with what they had. Anyway, it's a woody shrub. It has sort of an arching branch habit, and so it has another kind of unique feature, which is when those branches arch all the way over and the tips hit the ground, that tip will then send down roots. It's what's called layering. Some of you who are gardeners are probably familiar with this, but the ability to do that allows it to sort of leapfrog across the ground and across the forest, and take over fairly quickly. It's very shade tolerant, so it can grow under a really dense forested canopy. The leaves are alternately arranged on the branches. They come out in clusters, sort of in a whorl, in a circle, all in one point, both common and Japanese. The Japanese have a smooth edge along the edge of their leaf, whereas, as you can see here, the common has a toothed edge, and they both have this really bright yellow sapwood. The thorns, they're a little hard to see. In fact, I think there's one maybe you can see over in this neck of the woods, but the Japanese barberry has a single thorn coming down everywhere where leaves are attached to the branch, and the common has 3 thorns at each leaf axil. For some reason, this is not advancing when I ask it to. Okay, so some of the issues with Japanese and common barberry is they change the pH of the soil, which changes the suite of species that can grow in that area. We talked a little bit about layering already and shade tolerance. The biggest problem, and the reason why, if I were you and if you have this on your property, I would prioritize it for control, is this association with deer ticks and Lyme disease. And they found in research done in Connecticut that there are 12 times as many ticks in a place with dense barberry infestation as opposed to an area without barberry. And the incidence of Lyme disease in those ticks was even higher than in the general tick population in the area. And there are 2 reasons for this. One is, if you can look at this plant, you can sort of understand it. Underneath that plant is a great place for mice to hide. It's perfect habitat for them. They're protected from predators. So when you have a lot of barberry, you have a lot of rodents, especially mice, and mice are terrible at getting ticks off. So ticks are more successful. You have more ticks. The other thing that's interesting is, and they found that this is actually also true under really dense honeysuckle stands, is that because there's so much shade under there, it actually changes the microclimate, and the relative humidity under those plants is much higher than in the surrounding area. And one thing that ticks are really sensitive to is relative humidity. If it gets too dry, they dry out too. So they have to be in a place that's really humid. So if you have really dense barberry, the humidity under there is higher. And so you get this sort of double whammy of even better success for the ticks. So if you have barberry, you might want to think about trying to pull it out. So thinking about control, pulling is actually fairly successful if they're small plants. Long sleeves and gloves are definitely recommended. And as has always already been mentioned, if you do it like now when the ground is really wet, it's a lot easier. Another way to control them is through burning with a propane torch. I'll talk a little bit about what I'm doing right and wrong here with this particular picture. This is on a property that the Land Trust owns in West Brattleboro. And one thing that I'm not doing right here is I didn't rake the leaves out of the way first. So I burned a lot of propane and spent a lot of extra time because it had to burn through all those wet leaves first before it got to the plant. The thing about Japanese and common barberry is they have a root crown right where all those canes are coming out of the ground. There's a root crown, and on that root crown is where most of the dormant buds, similar to the ones that Helen was talking about, are. So if you can superheat that root crown, you'll kill them all, and you'll kill the plant at the same time, and it won't resprout. But if you have a lot of wet leaves there, it's going to take you a lot longer. So I recommend you bring a rake, a metal tined rake with you, and rake the leaves off of the plant before you try to burn it with the torch. And as you can see, I was doing this in the rain. It doesn't look like it's raining very hard. It was raining though, and it had rained a lot the night before. And if you're going to play with propane torch, I recommend you make sure it's really wet, because this thing makes hundreds of thousands of BTUs. It is really hot and it can start a fire in a hurry. So make sure it's wet if you do it. The other thing I'm not doing right here is I don't have hearing protection on. You might not think it, but these things are really loud. They really scream. And so hearing protection is a must. Eye protection would probably be a good idea too. So if you're hesitant to use chemicals, this can be a fairly easy way to control the barberry. You just have to be really careful if you're doing it. And if you have really dense or extensive barberry, I would hire a professional to come in and do the chemical control. The thing about hiring a professional is it's their job to do this. They know how to do it with the least amount of chemical, and they know how to identify the natives versus the invasives. They'll be very careful about making sure that the natives are protected from the treatment, and the formulation that they use is going to be way better than anything you could get off the shelf in a hardware store and apply yourself. So if you're going to try to take this on and use chemicals, which sometimes is the only way when you have a really extensive infestation, definitely hire a professional. And the last thing I want to talk about a little bit is some of the native alternatives. So if you control all your barberry and you're looking for something that has that nice brilliant red foliage in the fall, high bush blueberry is a great one for that. It also has the advantage, obviously, of having berries. And if you're looking for something with red berries to attract birds, winterberry holly is a great alternative. The problem with the berries on barberry, like Sam was talking about with the buckthorn, is they are just junk food. They're really low in protein and fat, so they're really bad for the birds and wildlife. So, but winterberry is awesome. So I guess with that, I will pass it on to Isabel to talk about bush honeysuckle.
So bush honeysuckle originated in Asia and Western Europe. It was planted, like a lot of these, for ornamental purposes, but also for erosion control and wildlife cover, except for these plants alone are really not sufficient for wildlife, for animals to subsist on, just like Peter was saying. For honeysuckle, at least, it's like candy for bees because it's just one source of, they really can't get to the nectar, they can only get to protein, and bees need both, or sorry, they can get to the pollen, which is protein, and then it's hard to get to the nectar, and they need both to survive. So not ideal. And as you can see from the pictures, it's a woody shrub, and you can see as an ID, just so Peter doesn't have to go back and forth, the bottom picture shows sort of a hole running through the stem, and that's an easy way if you're cutting to identify the species. But if you go on the next slide, I have more tips and tricks for identification. So there are different ways to identify it. If you look at the fruit, like in the top right picture, you see these 2 red berries in a group. Some people were taught to see this grouping as what are called butt berries. If that helps you remember, great. It's pretty easy to tell when you're looking at how close they are together to identify it. For the flowers, they can be white or yellow, and then they have very thin petals. And they also have flaky bark because they're woody shrub. They've got this bark that will peel off. And then it can grow between 6 and 20 feet tall. They have opposite leaf orientation, as you can see in pictures up there. And they have a smooth margin and are shaped sort of in like a elliptical pattern. As I mentioned before, the twigs have this hollow pith in it. And for spreading, the honeysuckle spreads mainly through wildlife by seeds. So if you go to the next slide, I'll talk about removal or control. So the best method is probably hand pulling if you catch it early, because it won't likely resprout from the roots. You can pull the plants at the base of the stem, and that way you get the entire root system. Just like we mentioned before, it's great if you do this during, right now, we've got softer ground, much easier to pull it at that point. You can also, for more established populations, use that weed wrench that Sam had talked about, or other tools to help pull it out. And then we've got the stem cutting, which we've talked about before. I think Sam mentioned this as well. So you cut the stump, and then here there's a picture of someone painting on the herbicide. So really just getting that tiny amount that's necessary to kill the plant. And in terms of similar looking species, I included a picture here of American honeysuckle. We have different native honeysuckles to Vermont. And this one, the American honeysuckle, has these yellow tube-shaped flowers, and their leaves are hairy. So they look pretty different. And then lastly, I'll say that if you were looking to plant other species that would give that would survive in a similar area, just like the ones Peter said, winterberry and that blueberry would be good alternatives and would be great for the wildlife. And that's it for me. I think Corey is up next.
Thanks, Isabel. So if you've spent any time along the West River, or really most of our water courses in Windham County anymore, you've definitely seen knotweed. This is an introduced species from Asia. It was brought over because it was thought that it would help stabilize riverbanks, and unfortunately we've learned it has the opposite impact. It is a shrub-like herbaceous perennial that grows to be very, very large. On the next slide, we've got some more stats about it. It grows to be 3 to 10 feet tall. For identification, small greenish white flowers in the summer, and then these turn into winged fruits, triangular, tiny, shiny, triangular seeds. You'll see these everywhere around a knotweed patch later on in the summer or fall. A really good way to tell it is that the stem is smooth, hollow, and jointed. It kind of looks like bamboo to me. Young stalks are reddish, and then those dead brown stalks remain well into the winter, so you can still tell where there was knotweed and will again be knotweed along a river somewhere. Knotweed's one of my personal nemesis because we do a lot of trees for streams plantings, and you can't really do a trees for streams planting until you've addressed the knotweed because it will just outcompete anything you try to plant around it. It's very aggressive. Leaves are alternate, smooth edged, broad, and heart-shaped. And a really challenging part about knotweed is that it can spread from fragments of root and stem. And often if you see, like, there's a spot near where I live in Brattleboro where there's knotweed on either side of the road, and it's very likely the same plant. And so that's where, like, if you don't eradicate the whole patch, you're not really accomplishing anything. And then with it spreading from fragments of root and stem, that's a real challenge for control because you've got to get every single piece. And it's along streams, so it's really easy for one of those pieces, if you're cutting it out, to end up in the river and to wash downstream and to establish a new colony. In terms of control options, there aren't super great ones, although we're really hopeful that some things are going to get figured out. Some folks have experimented with wire mesh. The Land Trust tried this at their Whetstone Preserve property in West Brattleboro. And so you put wire mesh down, and then the knotweed grows up through it. And then as it grows larger, it girdles itself against that wire. And so then the plant responds by sending out more shoots, and the same thing happens. And over time, it depletes the plant's carbohydrate store. And so hopefully you can sap the strength, but this will take multiple seasons. And of course, if you have a really large infestation, it's pretty expensive to get that much wire mesh down, and then you have to leave it down for a long time. Some folks have tried digging it out, and that means you've got to get all the roots. I know the Rockingham Conservation Commission has been doing this on some of their property and having success, but it's a very labor intensive. Some folks have had success smothering it with like heavy black plastic and then cardboard, and that similarly needs to be done for multiple years. There is a lot of interest around a hot water injector. We have yet to see this used down here yet, and we're trying to, we want to get a program together and like try it out and see if it is effective. Knotweed's a really huge challenge in the United Kingdom, where I think it was introduced before it was introduced here, and it in many places is damaging the foundations of like homes and buildings, and can actually impact like the ability to get a mortgage if you have knotweed on your property. So they're a little bit ahead of us, I think, in figuring out some of these treatment approaches. And then, of course, herbicide is effective with knotweed. That's what has been used on Sam's property. And when you have these really large infestations, it's pretty difficult without herbicide to have success. And then I think next Peter is going to talk about VT invasives and some of the great resources there.
Thanks, Corey. I think there's a lot of great information coming in this webinar, but I think if there's one thing that I want everybody to bring home, it's this website, vtinvasives.org. It is the place to go to learn anything about any invasive in Vermont. It's got insects, it's got animals, it's got plants, and it's got a ton of information to help you with identification and control. So if you are looking for help with that, this can be a good first place. You can also contact any of us or the Southeast Vermont CISMA, and we'll try to help you out. One of the things that's great about some of the species, not all of them, but some of them, is this phenology chart, which shows you how the plant progresses through the year. So for instance, for this burning bush or winged euonymus, it's flowering from mid-April to June. It's leafing out starting in sort of mid or early April and lasting through to October. Its seeds are coming in over the summer. And it also shows you where you're going to be most effective when you're doing various types of control. So you can try manual hand pulling anytime. If you're cutting or mowing, it's probably going to be most effective. If you're doing it in the spring and early summer, direct flame, like I was talking about with the barberry, is most effective in the spring, and then follow up in the summer. So if you have questions and you can't get a hold of one of us, or you just want to look into a certain species, this is really a great website to check out. So vtinvasives.org. And next I'm going to turn it over to Andrew, and he's going to talk a little bit about integrated pest management.
Thanks so much, Peter.
Sure.
I'm here to talk to you about integrated pest management, often referred to as IPM. And this is practice of using multiple approaches combined to get effective control on whatever pest it is that you're looking to manage. And the foundation of the idea of integrated pest management is that you get the greatest success when you use multiple approaches simultaneously. So when you apply all four or as many as you have access to, you're going to get the greatest level of success. So the four approaches that are commonly referred to, Peter, if you could go back for just a moment, are the biological approach, a physical approach, a chemical approach, and a cultural approach. And a biological approach is something that is primarily executed as a regional response. And so maybe for an invasive insect, you might have heard that for emerald ash borer, which is an invasive insect pest, there are parasitic wasps that are being released to help control that invasive insect. And so that's typically a biological control is not something that you as a landowner can execute yourself. It's something that has required a lot of paperwork and research to get underway, and it's being done in a regional approach. But some of these others are definitely things you can do. And so the physical pest management is many of the mechanical treatments that we heard spoken about today, things such as hand pulling or buckthorn baggies, wire mesh. All of those are mechanical treatments to try to address this situation. And the next one is the chemical approach, typically utilizing chemical herbicides. Across various presentations, I've also heard of people using other chemical treatment methods, such as concentrated vinegars or salt sprays and things like that. And I would focus here very heavily on chemical herbicides. These are products that are heavily regulated. The content of them is well known, and the safety precautions are well understood. Some of those other chemical approaches that could be thought of as like homegrown solutions are not regulated, and in many cases are not as targeted as the chemical herbicide approaches. So, and then the last piece of this is the cultural piece of integrated pest management. And that really is about changing our approach and in some cases our lifestyle to help reduce the incidence of pests. So many of the presenters today talked about, what are some ornamental alternatives to these invasive plant species, most of which were brought here for ornamental purposes in the first place. And so that's one way that a change in cultural approach can help to address the pest management situation. So Peter, we can move on to the next slide. Thanks. So I get to the job of talking to you about herbicides. It's usually no one wants to be told about that herbicides are the way, but that's my role today. And I want to start by talking about what I think of as the three important criteria when evaluating any option for invasive plant control. And I've got those questions right there. Is this approach going to be effective? Is it going to be safe for yourself and other organisms? And is it going to be efficient? Because to be honest, across the landscape, there's much more invasive plant control that needs to happen than we really have the time or funding for. And as individuals, as landowners, there's often more to be done on your property, be it related to invasive plant control or other exciting ideas you might have about improving wildlife habitat or whatever else. Our time and our financial resources are limited. And so we want to make sure that however we're applying those, that we're doing it efficiently. So Peter, if you could go to the next. So I want to talk about chemical herbicides in this context of effective, safe, and efficient. And chemical herbicides, we do know that they are very effective. They have predictable and consistent results, especially if they're applied professionally by individuals who are, know the timing of when to use them, know the effective concentrations, know what adjuvants are necessary to make them effective. They're also effective in the sense that they can be targeted in their control. So there are classes of chemical herbicides that kill woody plants, but don't kill grasses. And so if you're dealing with a situation where you've got a combination of invasive plants in a grassland setting, they can be a way to achieve targeted control. And targeted control can also be achieved by the way that they are applied to plants. And some of the other alternatives to using herbicides are not as targeted in their control. And so for an example, a large mowing machine that might be very effective in removing invasive plants is difficult to use in a targeted approach. It's going to mow down everything in its path, be it native or invasive. Something similar could be said about using grazing animals like goats. So they're also effective in the sense that they provide lasting control. So many of these chemical herbicides are destroying the root system of the plant that they're being used to treat. And so unlike some of the other methods like Helen was talking about Asiatic bittersweet and how it requires, if you're going to mechanically control it, you need to be back there every 2 weeks cutting. An herbicide application can be have much more lasting control because it's destroying a much larger portion of that root system. So the second question is, are they safe? And the answer to that is generally yes, right? Chemical herbicides all have their hazards, and that's why they're heavily regulated. That's why you're supposed to use protective safety equipment. And that's why there's instructions that come with them on how they're to be properly applied. But when they are applied by a certified professional applicator, they can be as safe as many of the other methods we spoke about this evening. And I thank you, Peter, for talking about the use of a torch for Japanese barberry control and highlighting the different, ways that you need to use that technique to make sure that you're safe. And the same could be said about using saws for cutting, or using heavy machinery for cutting, or using the pull bar that Sam Schnesky introduced everybody to. So just like any of those other methods, to make sure that these are being used safely, they need to be used the way they're intended to. They need to be used with the proper protective apparel. And a professional applicator should know all of those and be able to do that in a safe fashion. And so then lastly, are they efficient? And I think it's really unarguable that they are efficient. They are a great multiplier for person hours. Invasive plants are a landscape-wide problem, and we really need to have some landscape scale solutions. And so, with our scarce financial and time resources, chemical herbicides can be that multiplier that really helps us get ahead of control. And that's a decision that's been made by the federal government. I think you'll hear talk more about that with NRCS and the EQIP program. And it's a decision that's been made by a lot of conservation nonprofits, including the Vermont Audubon and the Nature Conservancy, that, these are an efficient tool that we can't overlook. And so if you could click one more time, Peter, just a reminder, there we go. Just a reminder that chemical herbicides really need to be used in the context of that integrated pest management. And so I think a great example of this, when Sam was talking about what was happening on his personal property under the EQIP, the contractor there started by using a mechanical approach to help reduce the volume of invasive plant material, help to get better access to the invasive plant material. And then they were able to follow up with a chemical approach to get that multiplying effect and to get that long lasting control. So if we're kind of taking all those approaches together as part of an effective strategy, then we're going to be much more effective at controlling this across the landscape. So please don't forget integrated pest management for that. And I think it's my job to pass it back to Peter. Is that correct?
It's back to me. Hi, I'm Emma. No, you're fine. I'm Emma Keister. I am the new soil conservationist in the Windham County NRCS office, so the Natural Resource Conservation Services office. And I have taken over for Joshua Allen in case some of you might have worked with him, or like Sam Farwell mentioned, he was the person who started that process with him with the NRCS. One of the main programs that we have and offer is called the EQIP program, or the Environmental Quality Incentives Program. And it will help cost share for all of this invasive management that we've already talked about. We do like to focus a lot on chemical because of its efficiency and its best use of taxpayer dollars. But with potential mechanical beginnings or dealing with certain situations, specifically like if there's organic fields near forested ground, we could also look at mechanical in those situations. Overall, our program is going to be a cost share program. We're only meant to cover about 60 to 70% of the costs of the removal, but it could potentially cover more. We have a fixed price that we pay per acre for the different types of removals that happen, whether it's a heavy stand of invasives or moderate or light. And then once we can certify that per acre, that's the amount of money that a person gets. There's no need to turn in bills. The way you become eligible for our programs is to register your land with the Farm Service Agency and then sign a form saying that that you don't make more than $900,000, which most landowners can usually manage. And then after that, we also need to certify that there aren't any wetlands that you have or that will be altered during the course of this. But in most of these forestry situations, that's not going to be a big deal either, unless you're trying to do a land conversion. And so those are some of the ways to get into the program. I'm the best person to contact right now in the Windham County office. I did put my contact information down at the bottom. Otherwise, you can just Google it. You'll probably get my supervisor's name whenever you do that, but she'll forward it to me and we can start working from there. Or obviously Corey or any of the NRCD staff can get to me as well. And let's see, we also do have a specialized invasive pool in Windham County that allows us to specifically address this problem in our county. So in the southeast of Vermont. And that's one of the opportunities that we have to really deal with this issue. We do have a grants webinar tomorrow. I know Isabel was planning on talking about that more tomorrow, but that's another opportunity to look at the different ways to fund conservation projects in your area. So with that, I think I'm going to turn it over to the next slide.
Thanks, Emma. I'm just going to leave this slide up a little bit while we cover a few things. There's some more resources here for you. The vtinvasives.org website that I talked about, New York Department of Environmental Conservation website. Go Botany is the Native Plant Trust website. It's great for identifying both native and invasives. There's the Natural Resource Conservation District website. If you go there and poke around, you can find all the recordings from a series of invasive plant webinars that we did a couple of years ago. I think there are 6 of them. And I guess we'll move on to the Q&A portion that Isabel's going to help us get through. But maybe before we do that, you want to talk about the upcoming events, Isabel?
Sure. So this event was part of a series, as we heard from Sam talking about his land. There is an in-person site visit that's on June 7th. And you can register. I will put the links in the chat for this event, as well as the event that Emma touched on. So the grants webinar, is tomorrow at 10. And we have different groups coming in to talk about different grant opportunities. So if NRCS doesn't fit, maybe the Vermont Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets will fit. But we'll also just talk about resources that will help you get what you need. So I'll be putting those in the chat now.
Isabel, I have a question. Will the grants webinar tomorrow be recorded if folks can't make it?
Yes, great question. It will be recorded and we can send it out to this group if people want that.
That's great. Thank you. So we're getting close to the end of our time, but if we have a few questions, maybe we can cover those now.
I can read the question that was in the chat. And that was from Annette. They ask, is anyone talking to professional landscaping companies, lawn cutting services to make sure they're using good methods to stop the spread of invasives, as we ask voters on their mowers and other equipment? Anyone want to take a stab at that?
I'm not sure if anyone's talking to landscaping companies. I think one of the biggest issues that we've been talking about recently within this CISMA and also the other CISMAs in the state, there are 5 of them, is the issue around AOT and town road maintenance and mowing associated with that. We haven't really started to crank up that conversation yet, but it is something that we'd like to tackle. Another issue that we didn't bring up and is sort of tangentially related that I'd like to cover is when you go out and buy plants, just be very careful about what you're getting. And also, if you're going to somebody else's garden and they offer you a flower, it's a really generous thing to do, but be aware that something else might be coming along with it. We got some flowers from friends of ours when we built our house, and we also got goutweed along with it, and that was 30 years ago, and we still have not been able to control the goutweed. So just be aware, be careful about what you're bringing into your landscape. As was mentioned earlier, the Conservation District has a native plant sale that's happening next weekend. I think there are still a few things available. If you're looking for stuff to put in, if you go to the Conservation District website, you'll be able to find the list of plants that are available, and Corey can help you out with that. Were there any other questions, Isabel, or does anyone else want to cover the question that was asked?
I guess I'd just point out that we do have a noxious weed list in Vermont. So, and some of those, either some or all of those, have been kind of deemed not legal to sell at nurseries in Vermont. So more on that if you go to VT Invasive stuff, or you can find out information on what's been listed.
Thanks, Sam.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Nora.
Well, it's sort of several that are all sort of the same. So, is the American bittersweet native to Vermont?
Yes, it is.
And what about the common buckthorn?
That is not.
So but that is not so invasive? No, that's invasive also, right?
Yes.
Okay. And I was just a little bit confused. Well, also, what exactly is a buckthorn baggie?
I'll take that one, Sam.
So it's basically a black plastic bag that's heavy duty plastic, kind of like a contractor's bag, except smaller. You don't need something that huge. And you tie it, you cut the top off of the buckthorn stem and then cover it, basically smother it with this bag. And I think there's zip ties that come with it, or you could tie it using string, but tie it around the stem so that you essentially smother the what's left of the stem, and it tries to sprout on the stem, but of course can't succeed because it's in the dark. There's another thing I've tried fairly successfully is to use soup cans, old soup cans. And if you have buckthorn that's small enough to fit in a soup can, you cut the stem off like 3 feet off the ground, so you don't have to bend over at all, and stick the soup can upside down on it. And that seems to work pretty well too. It looks funny for a while, but whatever.
And then one last question, these herbicides that the professionals are using, do they have like negative side effects that I mean, I know sometimes you have to weigh. It's like, okay, I'm going to use this, even though it might do something that isn't the main intention, but it's going to get rid of this very invasive plant.
Yeah, Nora, I'm happy to speak to that. And the answer is yes. Chemical herbicides can have negative side effects. You know, they are poisons that are designed to kill plants. And so if you get them on native plants, those plants will also die. And some of them also have could have residual effects on the environment, and that's usually part of that label. So some of these herbicides can't be used near water or wetlands because of the impact they can have on fish or amphibians. And so that's where having a professional who's properly using them will know which herbicides are appropriate for what areas and can work to minimize some of those negative side effects, because the negative side effects can be really disastrous if the herbicides are used incorrectly. So yeah, it's important to weigh those pluses and minuses and have that be part of your decision. I also wanted to clarify your earlier question about American bittersweet and if it was native, and it sure is. And I wanted to emphasize that all of the plants we talked about today as being invasives are not native to our region, that none of our native plants are or ever really could be considered to be invasive.
We have a question in the chat from Deborah. They ask, with global warming and other environmental challenges, are native plants already suffering, and should we manage for a new climate?
I could take that if others, or I could start by taking that. There are opportunities to manage for changing climate conditions and do things like assisted migration if you want to, you know, if you're thinking about doing some native plantings and you want to plant a species that occurs slightly south of where we are or is uncommon in the state of Vermont, you could do some assisted migration. I want to respond to this though in the context of invasive plants and say that with all of the other changes and threats that are going to be brought about by climate change, really one of the ways that our native ecosystems can be best prepared to meet that challenge or that set of challenges that is in their future is by being healthy and intact. And so ecosystems that are already under threat from invasive plant species are going to be less well-positioned and less resilient to some of the other changes that we're experiencing due to climate change. So it really is another reason that we really should be thinking about and addressing invasive plant species on our landscape. Anybody else have some thoughts on that?
I think that's great, Andrew. I was going to make a similar point that really the best way we can set up our native ecosystems, our native plants and animals, is to make sure that those invasives are controlled so that they are as healthy as can be and can deal with all those stresses.
So we have another question. People are done with that one. Sam asked, has anyone worked on species distribution models to see what other non-natives are potential invasives that could come to Vermont? The ones that EDRR would work on.
Yeah, that's a great question. There are definitely people that have done that work. I think one thing that we're trying to do with all the CISMAs is to work together to share information. So right now we have one down here in the southeast, there's one in the Battenkill area, there's one in the sort of middle of the state in the White River area. And then there are two up in the Northeast Kingdom, one along the Connecticut River and one in Orleans County. And one of the things that we can do is share information with each other and talk about what things are new and coming into various regions, like the Japanese stiltgrass that's showing up in Brattleboro. It's nowhere else in the state that we know of. And so it's really important for us to share information across boundaries to let people know what's coming. And we also have to pay attention to other invasive plant organizations and states around us to see what's there and to know what's coming. So things like hardy kiwi, for example, is just over the line down in northern Massachusetts and may be coming this way eventually. So it's a really important thing for us to all pay attention to what's around us and what may be coming.
I think what Peter said is exactly right. I just want to add, I did research with bumblebees on this topic, and we were looking at how bumblebees reacted to the change of plants. And sometimes the bumblebees knew ahead of time because plants move, slower than a bumblebee because they can fly. So sometimes you can look at what different pollinator species are moving or how the birds are moving, and that's a good way, also a good indicator of what's going to be happening in the future.
Do we have any other questions? If not, does anybody else want to have any parting words?
I guess I'd like to mention that now is a great time to try to identify a lot of the common invasives. They seem to become visible before many of our native alternatives. They're better adapted sometimes for those early season conditions. So it's a good time to go for a walk on your land or just keep your eyes peeled as you're driving around, although it can be a little bit depressing. And I would encourage you to think about coming out to the June 7th site visit. It'll be a great chance to kind of see how one of these projects goes from that initial contact to seeing the site managed in a comprehensive way. And it's a site we'll be planting trees to the Trees for Streams program in another year, kind of like wrapping on things up really nicely. So it should be a cool site visit, and hopefully it'll be nice weather by then. I'd like to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us this evening. Very much enjoyed the conversation and the questions.
Corey, I think Helen has one more thing to add.
Yeah, has the survey, we made a post-event survey for people to take. Did that end up going out in the chat?
Yes, I put it in the chat, but I'll send it again in case it gets lost in the shuffle.
It would be great to have folks respond to this survey. One of the things that the CISMA really wants to do is make sure that we're responding to folks with their needs and doing things that are helpful to you. So please fill out the survey if you can, give us a little bit of guidance. And thank you for coming.